My friends, it gives me a very great pleasure to invite an old friend back to our club today. John is one of those Canadians whose hand has touched an enormous range of people and institutions and always left them enhanced as a result. Whether it was Canadian football or cable TV, the Conservative Party of Ontario, talk radio, the John Tory legacy is one of deep civic engagement, genuine empathy and compassion, and an elegance and personal style that everybody I know, including me, envies and tries to emulate. John, as his family name shouts, comes from the bluest of Ontario blue blood. As a child of privilege and of guaranteed opportunity, this is a serious point. As a child of privilege and guaranteed opportunity, John could have taken his chair at many comfortable sinecures and had a very pleasurable and quieter life, but that wouldn't have been John Tory. He's thrown himself into one commitment to improving this city, this province, and the country year after year, decade after decade. His most recent being a plan to save and revive Ontario Place, and then taking what we used to call the Toronto City Summit Alliance to a new level. His example to all is that privilege imposes obligation. His history is one of total grace under pressure, even in the face of undeserved defeat. It's been my privilege to call John a friend for most of our lives. I'm very proud and pleased to introduce him to you today. Oh, and by the way, no questions about future mayoralty prospects, please, when we get to the question period. Or Barbara Hackett will have his head, yours, and mine. John.
Well, Robin and ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I knew that I might be in for some trouble being introduced by Robin when he said earlier on, I don't know if you caught this, but he said, we're about to have the most exciting moment of the entire lunch, the draw for the door prize. Did you catch that? I sort of thought, well, gosh, that sort of means he's written off the speech already, but Robin and I, I've been a strong believer and I continue to be a strong believer, and some of what I'm going to say today really speaks to the question of collaboration and civility in the public interest in politics between and among people of all parties. And Robin and I have participated in some epic chapters in the political life of this province and of this country. We, for example, were two of the people involved in a very famous negotiation, many are too young to remember in this room, where the last time there was a minority government elected, it was uncertain as to who would form the government, and there were some famous negotiations that took place between and among the NDP, the Progressive Conservatives, and the Liberals. And I was one of the Conservative representatives, and Robin was one of the NDP representatives, and I guess we lost. But having said that, it was a unique chapter, and these are one of many things that you go through, of course, in a life that has, for me, been very interesting, and I'm sure for Robin, but what you come to realize is the character of the other people that you deal with, and you appreciate how much people of character populate a large part of the process that we both think is very important, regardless of what party they're a part of. I want to just say before I start talking about what I came to talk about today, that first of all, say thank you to IBM, and there are two representatives here from IBM, both for sponsoring today's lunch, but more importantly for sponsoring some of the activities of civic action, especially as regards public transit, which I'm going to talk about quite a lot today, because I think it's such a vital issue to the future of this city region and indeed to the future of this province. And IBM has been a very public-spirited company in that regard, and we appreciate their support. And certainly my friend Mitzi Hunter, who's the CEO of Civic Action, I knows and joins me in saying thank you to IBM and all the other people who've stepped up to help us. And in that regard, I also want to say to Bruce McQuaig, it was mentioned earlier that he is one of this region's outstanding public servants, and he is. A lot of people don't know what Metrolinx is, but it is not only the body that will be responsible going forward for implementing a plan that really must be implemented for the welfare of everybody who lives here and for our children and grandchildren, but also he is a person who has devoted a lot of his life to public service, and it runs today the GO Transit system. A lot of people don't know that that's part of what Metrolinx does. So Bruce, thank you for your public service. Now, the last time I was here, I should tell you that I started off my speech because I checked. What I wanted to check on actually was whether I had, when I stood here as the leader of the opposition in the middle of an election campaign in 2007, whether I had made mention of out-of-control spending and boondoggles and irresponsible use of the taxpayers' money. And indeed, I did. I was very gratified that I had, because I'm sure I would have. But I did mention that I had gone into the washroom. I was a bit late getting to the podium because I'd been in the washroom trying to put on my contact lenses, and I was unsuccessful. And I therefore apologized to all the people in the audience that I knew, because I wouldn't have recognized they were out there. Subsequent to the results of that election, what you referred to, I think, as a defeat that I experienced, one of a couple, I just decided I wouldn't bother wearing my contact lenses when I spoke to audiences anymore, because frankly I didn't really concern myself with who was out there, because I'd already been defeated. And so I will tell you that I stopped wearing them in the legislature too, because I figured, what did it really matter if I could clearly see Dalton McGuinty across the legislature not answering my questions? What did it really matter? It really is an honor for me to be here at the podium of the Empire Club. I think it is the podium of record in Canada's largest city, and for me to be invited back is a great honor for me. I will say that, you know, if I look at my own career, that there's one thing that's consistent about it. I have lived my entire life in Toronto. Sometimes that can have been a liability in politics, to have lived your entire life in Toronto, but everything that I've ended up doing because I've lived here and worked here has been connected to the life of the city and to life in the city. And that has been my good fortune, and has only served to deepen my commitment to make sure that, as best one can, working with others, that it's an even better place for future generations. And I'm very concerned, I'll be honest with you, as a Torontonian and as somebody very involved in the sort of fabric of the city today, that over time, the thinking of leaders responsible for the future of the Toronto region has become increasingly short-term, focused on a meeting that's going to be held next week or an election that's going to be held next year, instead of a focus on the next decade or the next generation, which is what I think you are sent to public office to do. I mean, there are things you have to worry about that are of the immediate nature, but there are many other things that really require much longer-term thinking. I often use these days the example of the Gardiner Expressway. Our city leaders, as you read this weekend in the newspapers, have in front of them a proposal to spend $500 million or more patching up, I argue, with popsicle sticks and glue, an expressway that's been there for a long, long time. And I used to think, like some people will urge us to think, that's all we can do. We just can't afford to do anything else, that's that. And then I started to ask myself, and I'll return to this a couple of times because I think it's time we really started to focus on this as people and put more pressure on our leaders. I started to ask myself, what will they think of that decision in 25 years? Will they be talking about how bold we were to implement that popsicle stick and glue repair plan with respect to the Gardiner Expressway, that we were far-sighted in investing in a makeshift repair program? Or might they give us slightly more credit if we used our imagination and the ingenuity and the money of the private sector to find a new way to both maintain an important transportation corridor, but at the same time to get rid of the existing structure, which has a lot of things going against it, including, in particular, obsolescence. And I think the same is true of the challenge presented by what we politely call our priority neighbourhoods, in which tens of thousands of our fellow citizens live today. We can apply a Band-Aid here or a Band-Aid there and hope for the best, or we could decide to be bold and to put the determination of government together with the imagination and the money of the private sector to work in revitalizing those neighbourhoods and addressing what I believe to be the single biggest overriding long-term issue facing our city, and that is ensuring the integration of everyone into the life of the city, everybody who lives here, everybody who's come here, invited by us to be here, and ensuring that those people who are here have equality of opportunity as a reality in their lives. Not something that's given to them or handed to them, just equality of opportunity to prove what they can do. The renewal of Regent Park, by the way, I think, while it's not perfect, proves that such a public-private partnership for renewal can be very effective. And, of course, an integral part of knitting the city together socially and physically and otherwise is quality public transit. And I want to speak to the current transit debate in the time available to me today, because I think it is the one that's sitting right in front of us at the moment and needs to be dealt with. And I think there are three principal reasons to urgently address our transit deficit now. First, we have all, whether we're as voters or business people or public servants or politicians, we have all presided over decades of inaction at the same time as this city region has been growing almost exponentially. And that's a good thing, the growth. Another example, I think, of incredibly short-sighted leadership by many parties at all levels of government, that we've just had an inactive file when it comes to public transit, largely inactive at the same time as we've had explosive growth. Second, a proper transportation system, including public transportation, but also including roads, adequate roads, is critical to our ability to attract investment and jobs and to improve our productivity, which we are constantly told we must do, including organizations like the Chamber of Commerce that my friend Pat is the chair of at the present time. And third, dramatically improved public transportation and transportation generally is a huge quality of life issue. We've been finding in our work with Civic Action that when you ask people what is the principal byproduct you experience from congestion, which people are acknowledging is now approaching a crisis if it's not already there, a lot of people cite things that have to do with the quality of their lives, with the lives that they spend or don't spend more properly with their families. But it's also an environmental issue. It's also a leisure time issue if you just simply take into account the need that most of us have for a balanced life. I think it is reaching the point across the region where we all agree on the need to do something about transit and transportation. I think there's almost unanimous agreement on that. And I think I can even see, notwithstanding the comments coming from some quarters, an emerging consensus on the need to identify specific funds necessary to pay for that transit, specific funds necessary to pay for that transit and for that transit only. And it is that issue on which I want to focus today. For starters, I think we should look elsewhere, just take a little look elsewhere to understand we are not alone in having to confront this issue. In fact, others have confronted it before. In that hotbed of anti-tax sentiment, Los Angeles, citizens voted 67% in favor of a sales tax dedicated to public transit. In Vancouver, right here in our own country, the Regional Transportation Authority relies on user fares, fuel taxes, and property taxes to fund public transit. Voters in Stockholm voted overwhelmingly in favor of extending a congestion pricing scheme after a trial period which began in 2006. In Bangkok, Thailand, they just had a successful IPO which raised $5 billion plus to build urban transit. That's a private solution they came up with there. And I'm not suggesting any or all of those specific measures for Toronto, just commending to you, rather, the courage and the foresight they had in those cities to decide they had to do something and to endorse various means of payment. And as you heard, all of those means of payment in those four examples, and I could have cited many more, they're all quite different from one another. So back to the Toronto region. I think there are two things holding us back from addressing these issues head-on and moving forward in a meaningful way and not getting bogged down again, such that we go for another decade without any real progress on this issue. The first obstacle is most evident at Toronto City Hall, not the rest of the region, because frankly, in the rest of the region, leaders of communities like Mississauga, Oakville, Vaughan, Markham, and Oshawa have addressed the funding issue in a balanced, relatively non-political way. At Toronto City Hall, on the other hand, we have seen develop a virtual pit of polarization, where everything on the part of everybody, and I'm not assessing blame on one side or the other, because a polarization requires by definition at least two people to be polarized, everything on the part of everybody comes down to kind of a my way or the highway, a false choice, and everything is declared to be an issue in the next election. There's only one problem with that. That election is 18 months away, and the public would have, in my view, every reason to remind the current administration, the entire current council for that matter, that they were already elected to govern and to deal with issues like transit now, not to just get ready for the next election. Similarly, as discussion of revenue-raising methods occurs, we find some people saying no need for any of those revenue tools we see listed in various places, including the most recent list put out by Metrolinx. Let's just get the money from eliminating waste. Now, I will say to you, perhaps immodestly, but I don't think so. There isn't a person in this room who could stand at this podium with a clearer conscience than me in saying that I contested the offices of both the Mayor of Toronto and the Premier of Ontario, warning years ago that our present levels of spending and taxation, for that matter, were not sustainable. But if that spending were to be properly addressed today, as it should be, and it's still not being addressed completely and properly, that would help us to eliminate ongoing annual deficits, but would not create the pool of dedicated money necessary to build transit. In Ontario, for example, as you know, we still have, by the latest account of the minister last week, a $10 billion deficit. So if you saved $2 billion annually starting tomorrow morning, you are going to be down to an $8 billion deficit. It will not create a pool of money necessary to build transit. I think most of you in this room understand that. Similarly, to those who say no need for those revenue tools, we can use private money. They are being even less straightforward with the voters, because private money of any kind, which should be used to build transit and, for that matter, to revitalize public housing in this city, just to cite two very important examples, that private money, as you know, must be repaid with interest. It's coming from somebody's pension fund, and of course they have an obligation to earn a return on that money, so it has to be paid back. And it still leaves, therefore, open the question of where the money is going to come from to repay the investment made by those pension funds. And indeed, it's frustrating to me, as I'm sure it is to many of you, as an Ontarian, to see our pension funds investing money in infrastructure projects all over the world and not here, because we haven't come up with a way to say, fine, we want to take your money, we want to invest it in things like transit, and we figured out how we're going to pay it back with interest. And lest I seem to be singling out City Hall for all of the criticism, some of the same politically motivated rhetoric has been heard in the halls of Queen's Park as well, despite what I will acknowledge is the honesty and the courage of Premier Wynne in addressing the transit funding issue head-on. Though, as I will point out in a moment, I think other aspects of her government's record may be the single biggest obstacles to actually getting the transit built and paid for. I have said many times, as a politician, as the head of Civic Action, as a broadcaster, that if there are two commodities more needed than any others in politics in 2013, they are honesty and courage. The honesty to tell people there is no free transit. There is going to be no transit that emerges out of the mist with money that's fallen from heaven or that is printed in the basement of one of the government buildings. That health care, simply by the numbers, if you do the math, is not sustainable in its present form on the present basis. Or that many pension plans, for example, are train wrecks just waiting to happen. But as you know, a lot of our political leaders continue to sugarcoat these issues in their own political interests. They're afraid to deal with them to some extent because we've made them afraid by saying, well, if you're honest with us, if you actually tell us the truth and level with us about some things we have to discuss, then I'm going to sort of shoot you because I don't really want to hear any of that sort of news. And the same is absolutely true on transit. Polarized politics and a lack of honesty and courage on this issue represent the first obstacle of the two that I mentioned standing in the way of achieving real progress. The second obstacle is the profound lack of trust, worse than I've seen it in 40-plus years of political activity, a profound lack of trust in how governments deal with our money. If we're assessing responsibility for this, I think, in fairness, more of the blame has to go to Queen's Park, where successive, massive spending scandals and generally unsustainable levels of spending have worn down the Ontario taxpayers and the Ontario balance sheet. As I said earlier, my message on this is consistent going back to my days as opposition leader almost 10 years ago. You can look it up and answer it. I got up, that's why I eventually took out the contact lenses. I mean, I got up every day and sort of said, you can't carry on this way. This is not sustainable. Pure math tells you that. And I was basically told that I was Mr. Negative and that I should go back to meeting with my friends on Bay Street and this kind of thing. I will say at the Toronto City Hall, thanks to some of the discipline and the determination of Mayor Ford, and he comes in for a lot of criticism, but thanks to some of the discipline and determination of Mayor Ford and his administration, things are better. They're better. But even now, we continue to see boondoggles unfolding, whether it's $500,000 in hand sanitizer flushed down the drain in recent weeks because the expiry date went past, a transit storage facility already tens of millions of dollars over budget before construction, or a transit commission which sees priority one in addressing customer service as being the appointment of 24 new managers at $100,000 each to manage subway stations. The public accepts the need, I believe. I think you'll agree with me. The public accepts the need for new transit and transportation. The public is showing growing acceptance by the day for the need to address transit and to address honestly and realistically how to pay for it. But the single biggest thing, I believe, with all the efforts that we're making at Civic Action and the Board of Trade and many others, Metrolinx, to get this issue on the table and get it discussed and build public support, the single biggest thing standing in the way of getting on with all of that is the public's justifiable fear that any money collected by whatever means will never make it to the building of transit and will instead disappear into the infamous black hole, wherever that may be. And that is why Civic Action has said that we must develop means to pay for transit, whatever they are. And we have specifically not taken a position on any one or more of the revenue tools. We've said, let's have the discussion and let's focus on principles. And I hope you'll take notice of a card that's on your table that's green and white and that asks you to go to a website where you can get more information and sign a pledge that doesn't commit you to supporting a given revenue tool, but rather says you support principles that say that we should find ways to raise this money that are fair, that are transparent, that is dedicated to transit, and so on, and that there's accountability that goes with that. And I would urge you to go to that website and add your name to those who support it. But we have said that whatever the means may be of raising this money for transit, they have to be fair, transparent, and dedicated so that people will know that everybody is paying their fair share geographically and across socioeconomic categories and so on, so they will know exactly what is done with the money, and so they will know that regardless of where and when, that it all goes to transit and to transportation. So what to do now is the question to avoid a failure of leadership which I think would be catastrophic for this city region and for our children and our grandchildren. Well, first, if it is humanly possible, I think we should dispense with the polarization and playing of politics on the transit and transportation issues. And so for starters on that front, I would urge Mayor Ford to agree immediately to an urgent City Council debate on how to pay for the transit that he agrees that we need in this city region. He would be welcome, of course, in the course of that debate, to stand up and reject all of the proposed revenue tools, every single one of them, to make his pitch, which I believe he believes in most sincerely, for subways, and to set out his preferred means of paying for those subways, as well he should. But to force the City Council to go to extraordinary lengths just to have a debate on a timely basis before Bruce McQuaig submits his report, as he's legally obligated to do at the end of this month, and deny the City Council the opportunity to have that input into that report, to me, is counterproductive and nonsensical. And I would say, by the way, that if the Mayor has a preferred and a realistic plan to pay for the subways that form part of his platform, I would expect he would be seeking out daily opportunities to present that alternative, including a council debate on that very subject. He should be welcoming places he could go to set out in detail his plan for paying for subways if he rejects all of the revenue tools that have been put forward by others. Now, as for some of the Mayor's critics, I think it is time they started to take a sincere look at a subway extension to Scarborough in place of the present SRT. That SRT is going to be replaced in any event, and although a subway extension at this stage, because there's some water that's passed under the bridge, as we all know, and the last thing we need to be doing is too many more changes to plans. That's part of the problem here. But I think, though it would present some complications, I think that particular extension in the form of a subway shows the greatest prospects for financial viability as a subway extension. And I think the Mayor, some of his opponents, should perhaps say that they would take a look at that, one more look at that. I think the Mayor's adversaries have an obligation to show some willingness to compromise so the City of Toronto, think about it for a minute, can go as a unified team to the province of Ontario and say, we speak as one for the residents of the City of Toronto within the region of the GTA, and we seek a subway extension, for example, to an underserved part of the city region. And again, I would ask yourself to look at it through that lens that I think we have to start looking at more of these decisions through. What decision would people think we should have made when they look back at this in 25 years? The second thing is that the polarization and playing of politics has to end at Queen's Park as well when it comes to the transportation issue. They're playing games there too, and you know it. Surely it isn't too much to expect that our three leaders, in a circumstance of minority government, on an issue very much related, in my view, and I think you'd all agree with this, to the social and economic viability of the largest city in this province and the economic engine of this province, surely it isn't too much to expect they might try going into a room, all three of them, together, and seeing if they could spend the time possibly coming up with something they could agree on as to how transit and transportation in this city region could be funded. Now, you know, you'll probably say to yourself, well, that's an awfully fanciful notion, figures it would come from him who's out of the business now and so forth. But I think it's fanciful only in the minds of those who have given up. We have allowed our leaders to think that politics can be placed ahead of the public interest for far too many years now, and I think those days should be over, because I think the consequences of placing politics ahead of the public interest are far too severe now in terms of the job opportunities for our kids and our grandchildren, in terms of the fabric of family life in this province, where people told us over and over again on our website, Civic Action, that they were paying a huge price for congestion that continues to exist and get worse in this region. Thirdly, I would respectfully suggest the Wynne government should spell out now, not a month from now, not 3 months from now, not after Bruce's report. They should spell out now a mechanism and a process to safeguard the money dedicated to transit, well before a single penny is collected or spent. You know, sometimes it's a cart and a horse thing. I think in this case, before anybody chooses the tools, before we can get people to support the use of revenue tools to pay for transit, they should know that there is a mechanism specifically that has been spelled out to say, here is how we will do our very best to make sure that that money is going where it's meant to go in a dedicated fund that is properly looked after. I've always thought that an arm's-length trust fund away from the politicians and in the hands of independent trustees, I've half-kiddingly suggested they should appoint as trustees Salvation Army officers and nuns, but having said that, only half-kiddingly, I believe such an independent trust, and if they spelled it out now and said, this is what we will do with the money, so you know where it will go and how it will be looked after, an independent trust audited each year by the Auditor General, who would tell the people, line by line, project by project, penny by penny, exactly what money came in and exactly where it went. And finally, while you may wonder what the gas power plant issue has to do with our success in finding an answer on the transportation issue, I would say a lot. That issue, perhaps more so than any other, has caused the public, I think, to go over the edge and conclude that governments generally have no regard whatsoever for their hard-earned tax dollars. And I say this without any sense of partisanship whatsoever, none. You heard me commend Premier Wynne earlier on for her courage in dealing with the transit issue. In my respectful view, we will be much harder pressed to emerge with a consensus on how to pay for transit unless and until the Government of Ontario does more than it has done to erase the stench of past mismanagement and incompetence, and to show the public there really is a new sheriff in town with some tough new rules in force. And I believe the following three things need to be done by the Liberals now for three reasons. The reasons being their own wish to save themselves politically, which is not my business, that's theirs. The need to make the progress we have to make on transit, which is our business and mine as the Chair of Civic Action, and because they are the right things to do. So I've probably listed them in reverse order, because if you start with the right thing to do, that's normally what you should be doing. The three actions that I believe Premier Wynne should take now if she wants to achieve success on the transit file would be these. First, an apology to the people of Ontario, not on her own personal behalf, but on behalf of the government that she was a part of and now leads. An acknowledgement these were political decisions which caused a financial fiasco and will never happen again. I think that's a start. I don't know what it is, frankly, about people in public life that makes it so hard for them to say, we acknowledge this was a screw-up and we're sorry. It doesn't solve the problem, but it at least lets people know that you get it. Secondly, specific and effective measures to satisfy us this kind of thing won't easily happen again. For example, I have often suggested that decisions such as this on the gas power plants and cancelling or moving them should be legally barred during an election campaign unless there's an emergency involved. When there's an election on, you just don't make those decisions. Those things don't happen. Elections last 35 days. You can get through 35 days without making what were acknowledged now to be strictly political decisions that cost us a fortune. And thirdly, a genuine, measurable, transparent addressing of inefficient spending and bloated bureaucracy. The Drummond report contained a roadmap to get us a good way along that path, and while I don't agree with all of it, nor would I expect the Liberals to, necessarily, it had a lot of necessary medicine in it, and more of its contents, should be implemented. I'm the last person the Liberals will rely on for political advice, but I do know this. Those three things, if they were done now, would provide some degree of help to those of us who are out there trying to sell the revenue-raising tools needed to pay for transit, not to mention that all three are the right thing to do, in my view, in any event, even if the transit discussion wasn't going on. Ladies and gentlemen, the decisions to be taken in the coming months are quite literally the decisions for a generation. In fact, a generation has already passed by where we didn't make a lot of these decisions, which make the ones that we have in front of us now any bigger, and I can't think of any that will be more important to the overall future of our city region. These are important decisions economically, they're important socially, they're important environmentally, and they're important to our overall quality of life. I read all the same surveys as you do about where Toronto ranks in the world, And I don't know about you, but I honestly believe, as objective as I can be, and I'm sure you try to be the same way, and if you take everything into account, every single thing you possibly could, that this may be and probably is the single best place in the entire world in which you could live and work and raise a family. The whole world. And I don't actually have any pony in the transit debate race. I don't have any pony in it. I mean, we have avoided at Civic Action taking stands on revenue tools. We've avoided sort of getting on one side or the other, except to say, look, we've got to do something. My sole interest as the chair of Civic Action, as a broadcaster, as a business leader, as a citizen, is to help us make the right, rational decisions about what needs to be done, to see those decisions made honestly and courageously, and perhaps most importantly, to see them made now, not years down the road. We can't afford to wait any longer. Maybe it is simple aging at work. I said recently on the radio, and I should say, by the way, at least 4 of my talk show colleagues here, Mike Bendixson, when he was introduced, by the way, they didn't mention, he's called the brand director. He's my boss. And he's about 25 years younger than I am, but he's obviously much smarter because he's my boss, and so that's that. But 4 of my talk show hosts, John Moore, Ryan Doyle, Jerry Agar, and she's not a talk show host, but she's our news director, Kim Geddes, are all here sitting over there. And I'm going to hear about this later because they will go on and say that this speech was the biggest collection of wet hay they'd ever, etc. So you live by the sword and die by the sword. But I was on the radio and I said I was in middle age at age 58. And some wiseacre, as they will do, phoned in and said, John, I got news for you. 58 is not middle age. And I said, well, you know, why not? Because I sort of always thought of your 50s as being middle age. And he said, well, are you planning to live to 116? And I said, well, that's a good point, but I hope so. And he then said, look, buddy, accept the fact you're well into the back 9. And I said, well, okay, never mind. It's absolutely the truth. Yeah, the listeners are wonderful. They really are. No, I mean that. Maybe it is simple aging and advanced later years at work, but I have increasingly come to look at most decisions of this kind through the following lens, and I've mentioned it twice today. 25 years from today, 25 years from today, how will people look at the decisions we made now, the investments we did or did not undertake, the way we built the city, physically, socially, economically? What will they be saying then, and what should we be doing now to make this a city that our children and grandchildren can be really proud of and can still say, standing up at this podium, somebody here 25 years from now, this is still the best place in the world in which to live? And I think if we focus on those kinds of questions in that sort of a time frame, if we get beyond the short-term politicking that seems to dominate everything nowadays, if we see some honesty and courage at all levels and in all parties, I believe the right things to do on a number of these issues I've touched on today, but especially on public transit, are actually quite evident. And as we all know, and I certainly had this lesson drilled into me over and over again by my late father, you can never go wrong, never, ever, doing the right thing. And I just hope that that's exactly what we decide to do on this important issue. Thank you very much for your attention. I am staying here because our president has indicated that there's some time for a few questions if anybody has any, or comments, and I'm excluding my friends from Newstalk 1010. They have plenty of opportunity at another time in another place to do whatever they want, and I have plenty of time to respond.
I think we have a microphone.
There is a microphone, so if you put your hand up, somebody will come and bring it to you, and I will do my best. And it doesn't have to be confined to transit if you think there's anything else that I might have a useful opinion on.
The chair to say, I don't know, I'm sorry, Barbara, but I think that'd be a pretty good mayor.
Yeah. People say to me, well, what do you think it would be like if you were to run for mayor again? And I say, well, I know this much. It would be very lonely living in a small apartment by myself.
Okay. Robin, I was going to say the same thing. I think, with that boldness and that vision, John, we all hope you're going to reconsider running for mayor next time. Really, we do.
Very kind.
I just want to say that I've taken the Civic Action Pledge, and many of you know that I'm a city councillor in the city of Mississauga, and of course we support the vision and the plan that our staff have released. We've released a report, and of course we have consensus on an LRT, not a subway, and we do support the principles that we don't want to see a property tax increase, and we also oppose transit fares because it's too undue a burden on the user pay system. But also our Mississauga Board of Trade have done a number of roundtables. I know, Bruce, you were part of them. And we prioritized RST, a dedicated fuel tax, and HOT lanes. But that said, there are some questions that remain unanswered, including who will prioritize which of the GTHA projects get funded and when. What about the inherent tension between the 905s and the 416s on whose projects and which funding tools? How will we fund the transit projects from outside the GTHA? And finally, since we do have a minority provincial government, I mean, is it realistic that we will look at funding tools that include taxes, tolls, and levies when we could be going into another provincial election?
Well, I mean, I'll answer your last question first and say, you know, and I alluded to this, I think that's part of the problem, is that everybody is focused on the short-term goal of getting themselves reelected and not taking any kind of courageous or bold stand on saying, and you know, by the way, if somebody wanted to stand up at Queen's Park and say, I think it should all be privately funded and we should have something that's actually owned by the private sector. I mean, I mentioned the Bangkok example because they just went out and raised $5 billion in a stock IPO, and they have a private company building their SkyTrain, as they call it. It's their downtown subway system. I personally don't prefer that. I think these things are better off in some kind of partnership or public ownership. But having said all that, I'd say, look, if we're going to get it done, then let's, in good faith, consider all models and at least have a discussion about it. But you know, to your point, people will not talk about these things because they're sort of focused on short-term political advantage. So I think the key to answering most of your questions is just that people try to submerge their personal and political and partisan interests for once beneath the public interest, and that means they will sort out which projects should be given priority within a big region where there's $50 billion worth of projects. In fact, a lot of that work has been done by Metrolinx, and people have bought into. 29 municipalities endorsed that program. So I think a lot of that work has been done, and then I think it's up to these independent trustees or whomever to kind of make sure things are done in a fair sort of way. But I think we blow these things up into great big huge issues because we've allowed politicians to convince us they are. And they're big issues, but they're not big issues in terms of people getting elected or not elected. I think that is a big part of the problem with the whole political process today is politicians, and I respectfully say that because you are one and I was one, but they spend far more time thinking about themselves and their own re-election and how things are going to affect them instead of thinking about the people that elected them to serve. And you know, that means decisions just don't get made. It doesn't mean bad decisions get made. No decisions get made, and that's almost worse than bad ones sometimes.
Please. Howard. Boom. You've got a loud enough voice.
John, terrific job. Thank you. I have a question for you specifically in terms of your challenge to the Premier. She has apologized for some of the spending that has taken place.
No, she has not.
Okay. Well, we can
she has not.
On that,
she said, no, I'm just being, I'm not, look, by the way,
sure.
I've had this conversation with her.
Sure.
So I'm not saying anything. She has not. She's acknowledged that we didn't do things quite right or one of those kinds of things. I think she's got to come out and say this was an epic screw-up, and it shouldn't be repeated, and I apologize to the people of Ontario. I tried to get Dalton McGuinty 3 times in one radio interview to just say those words, and he couldn't do it. And look, I respect him. I think he would have gone a long way if he'd done that, but she has not apologized. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but she has not.
No problem. So let's go to the bigger issue.
And she should.
The bigger issue is the future. There's been a number of proposals of the types of revenue-generating opportunities that are there. You said that Civic Action is not taking a position, but do you personally have a position on it? My belief is that politicians wait for a parade to form and then jump in front. And the problem here is we haven't seen the leadership of a specific idea of the 11 or so that have been presented. But do you specifically have recommendations on the types of revenue-generating tools that you think would find favor across the public?
I will say 2 things in response to that. First of all, one of the reasons as chair of Civic Action, and you can't separate yourself from that job, or even as a broadcaster, I sit there every day and express my opinions on everything, for good or for bad. I have said that I will wait until Bruce McQuaig puts his report out. He will make a specific recommendation as to how this should be funded, and we will at that time, I assume, have something to say about that. But I think it is respectful and appropriate that the main study commissioned by the government, which is due by the end of the month, we should wait and see what that says before I sort of go out and say, well, here's what we think at Civic Action or what some group of people think. The second thing I will say is that I tend to prefer those options that spread it out. on a wider basis across people, so that I think things that are narrower in their focus are probably less desirable and frankly probably raise less money. I think people are prepared to accept the fact that something is fair if everybody is kind of contributing to it in one way or another, and by that I mean people who live all places, people who do all kinds of things, people who are both businesses and individuals, and so on. And I think there are some tools you could see off the list that even Bruce published as a precursor to his report that might fit in that category more likely than some others. I mean, the problem with HOT lanes is they're fantastic, except they'll raise like $15 million a year, which is a good start, except $15 million out of $2 billion a year is just a good start. Last question?
Who's got the last question?
Who's got the last question? I don't hear where that's coming from, but there you go. I see I don't have the contact lenses in, so. Yes, sir.
My question is, Mr. Ford also agrees with building a casino. So if you were to pledge the revenue from the casino to fund the transit, would you agree with that?
Well, again, $100 million a year, if that's the number. I mean, and part of the problem is, I mean, I opined on the radio the other week, and by the way, Civic Action has not taken a position on the casino, and so I'm not speaking. I mean, I'm speaking, you've asked me a question, I'm answering it as John Tory. Last week, how they could have taken a vote to sort of move ahead to have a discussion of the casino without knowing the one thing that really matters, because I think if it weren't for the money, we probably wouldn't be doing this at all. I don't look at it as our economic development program for Toronto. I hope not, anyway. But having said all that, I tend to sort of look at this and say, well, all right, if we're going to have one, and they want to dedicate the revenue to transit, and again, that's something that sort of emerged out of the mists about a week ago all of a sudden, that it was going to be for transit, I think probably to change the tenor of the debate a little bit, then that's certainly something that should be taken into consideration in that debate. Myself, personally, I'll put it this way. I would be much more comfortable, if we're going to have one, that it should be located somewhere like Woodbine as opposed to in downtown Toronto. And I say that for the same reason that I suggested it shouldn't be at Ontario Place, because I think when you look at the heart, the downtown of a world city, and I think we are a world city, and we're going to increasingly become one as people look at this great thing we've got going here with people from all over the world coming here to build up this great city, that I'm not sure the best location for this is downtown. If you said to me the City Council decided to have one and they were going to put it at Woodbine, I'd be less concerned about that. So I'm sort of ambivalent. I think we already have casinos, so this notion of saying, well, they're awful, terrible things, we're well beyond that. We've had them for 25 years. So it's really just a matter of where and whether we need more. And there's all kinds of issues, as you know, I don't need to repeat them. But so I'd say, look, if you're going to have one, if that's what the vote of the City Council is, I would think it would be better if they put it out somewhere by Woodbine where there's already a racetrack, there's lots of undeveloped land, we need jobs out there. That would be where I'd end up on the thing, but that's a personal view.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
First, John, I'd like to assure you, you are not old. You and I were born in the same year, and I think that's enough said about that topic. I've known John since we were both teenagers, and we were both influenced by a premier who used to say again and again, good government is good politics. And I think John took that very much to heart. When I first knew him, he was a little bit quieter, a little bit shyer, but always respectful, always looking at the big picture, always trying to figure out what actions will help the most people possible and what actions will have the least negative effect. Now he is truly honest. He is a bit more bold, but still respectful, and shown us that confrontation and pointing out weakness can still be done very respectfully. And good government is still good politics. Thank you, John, on behalf of the Empire Club. We have enjoyed having you here, and I still think you look great and young.
This is beginning to feel dangerously like a draft. As a token of our appreciation on behalf of the club, I'd like to present you with a copy of Who Said That, a selection of the 100 best speeches of the last 100 years, in which yours will appear in the next edition. And I'd also like to remind folks here of some great events we have coming up. We have on Wednesday, Matthew Teitelbaum, Director of the AGO, and that's going to be in the Ontario Room. And the following Wednesday, Sheldon Levy, President of Ryerson, and it's going to be in the fabulous new Mattamy Athletic Centre, the old Maple Leaf Gardens. Finally, I'd like to thank IBM for sponsoring, Mr. Discount for sponsoring the student table, thank our National Post print media sponsor, Rogers TV, as our TV sponsor. We're very grateful to all of them for their continuing support. We're on Twitter and Facebook and at empireclub.org with a lovely new website. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again soon. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.